continue the course that we started on culture, and we have two last things to discuss. Stages of cultural shock, and then culture defined by anthropologists. So cultural shock, I'm sure you all heard this word before, because it's quite common since it is experienced by many people, not only anthropologists. So here let's look at what does it refer to, what does it mean. So basically cultural shock is experienced by travelers, expats, or exchange students, for example, and it describes the impact of moving from a familiar culture to an unfamiliar one. So it's the consequence of differences, being exposed to a different culture, and what does it create for the person. So as you can see here on the graph, there are different stages. So here there are four main stages that people go through. There is the honeymoon one, the frustration and anxiety one, the adjustment one, and finally the acceptance stage. So basically here it shows the different phases, different stages that we go through when we do a fieldwork, when we go abroad and we live among people that we don't know. That's what anthropologists do. First comes the honeymoon stage. The honeymoon stage, just like the word says it by itself, it's the first stage, and it's often, an overwhelmingly positive phase during which travelers, expats, students, or anthropologists become super excited about this new environment. They are happy to discover new people, new behaviors, way of living, new type of food, a new language, new surroundings, new environment. And at this stage, everything is exciting and everything is very positive. So this is the first one. Then comes the anxiety or the frustration stage. After a few weeks or months for people, but usually it comes after a few weeks, when the excitement is over, comes this anxiety or frustration phase, during which the person starts to feel annoyed by everything that surrounds him or her. So the first thing that were exciting at the beginning start to become annoying. So there is a fatigue of not understanding gestures. There is only small things, that could create frustration because the person is frustrated, not being able to understand the context exactly, not being able to talk the language, for instance, not being able to express himself or herself. And usually, so this is quite negative, as you can guess. And usually, like I said, it happens after a few weeks. And at this time, you just want to leave the place and do something else and go back to your own culture that you know and that you are used to. But eventually comes a third phase called the adjustment stage, when frustrations are let place to something else to slowly, like it says, an adjustment phase. So slowly what was annoying during the anxiety frustration phase becomes common and normal, and slowly the person gets used to this new environment, the new type of food, the different people, and slowly the person starts to have friends and to relate to the environment. So this is the adjustment. So it's not completely, it doesn't sound completely normal yet, but slowly the person is more and more used to the environment. and finally to a point that we call here acceptance, the acceptance stage. So generally, through sometimes, so weeks, months, sometimes years, it depends again of the person. The final stage of the cultural shock is acceptance. So acceptance doesn't mean that new cultures or environment are completely understood. There are some parts that are still difficult to get and to understand, but rather it signifies that the person can has personal relationship to this new environment. So it means that slowly the person gets also attached to this new environment. And usually, it's when it becomes familiar, when it becomes part of yourself, it becomes also part of who you are, and somehow a new culture that you just learned, and that is, inside of you. So this concept, cultural shock, is quite important in anthropology, because again, anthropologists, they go on the field and they experience that, all of them, or most of them. All right. And finally, I just wanted to talk briefly about culture, but how culture has been defined by anthropologists. So I don't want to give you too much theory here. However, I still would like to mention a few main thinkers for the discipline, and I would like to let you know what are the main school of thoughts that exist in anthropology. I think I told you that at the beginning of the chapter, that culture is probably the main topic for anthropologists, or at least for cultural anthropologists. And since the beginning of the discipline in the 19th century until now, 21st century, anthropologists have been trying to define what culture is. And of course, because like any other disciplines, it is influenced by other disciplines, other concepts, and also by the world itself and how it's changing. So the concept, what the concept of culture, what culture is, has also changed for anthropologists, and the way anthropologists view culture, it has evolved over time. So I just wanted to briefly tell you about how did anthropologists perceive culture from the beginning of the discipline until now. It will be very brief and it will just be an overview, and if you would like, I can of course give you more articles and more information about this. Let's start with what we called evolutionary theory. So we'll talk about this in a continuum way, in a linear view. So we'll start from the 19th century, beginning of the discipline, and we will slowly move over time. So in this, during this era, this time, researchers were very much influenced by Darwin's theory, by the theory of evolution. And that's, by the way, the reason why it's called evolutionary theory. So they were influenced by Darwin theory and biological evolution, which maintained that the diversity of biological species resulted from gradual change over time in response to environmental pressures. So they suggested that the vast diversity of cultures represented different stages in the evolution of human culture. So they view culture as a process of evolution through which humans and societies will go through. They set about plotting the world's culture along a continuum from the most simple to the most complex, using terms savage, barbarian, and civilized. So for them, cultures evolve. And Western cultures were, of course, remember that at that time, the 19th century is the big century of colonialism. So Western cultures and mostly Europeans considered themselves to be the civilized culture. And they wanted here to understand where some cultures had come from and predict where other cultures were headed. So they had this view, this unilineal cultural view of cultures. Here, those names here, and you can see Tyler here on the painting. So these are three main anthropologists of that time: Tyler, Fraser, and Morgan. I'm not necessarily asking you to remember those names. However, it's just for you, for your general knowledge, to know that they are considered to be the three main anthropologists from that time. So the theory of unilineal cultural evolutions has itself been criticized as racist for ranking different cultural expressions in a hierarchy, with European culture considered to be on top and considered to be the ideal. So here, savage, you can imagine that under this stage, savage, were found mostly colonized people from Africa, from South America. Barbarian were mostly um, ancient, well, cultures with ancient civilization, such as Egyptian, for example, or cultures from the Middle East, like Iranian culture. Or Indian one, and civilized, like I said, it was um, considered to be the Europeans. So, of course, this theory, like I just said, is racist because um, it classifies cultures and it creates a hierarchy, whether we cannot say and we cannot tell that there is a culture that is superior to another. They are all equal and they are all as important as the others. Now, there is someone very important who criticized that theory, and here it is. His name is Franz Bos. Franz Bos was a German-born anthropologist who founded the relativistic, culture-centered school of American anthropology that dominated the beginning of the 20th century. So he was German-born, like I said, but he moved to the US and he was fascinated by the Kwakiutl culture. The Kwakiutl are some Native American people living in the west of northwest of the US near Seattle, and the southwest of Canada, where is the Vancouver and British Columbia. So he studied the Kwakiutl, and based on this research, Boas collected a lot of ethnographic data, so not directly related to any specific project at first, but then it's more like a lifelong interest that he had for these people. And he also very much looked into their language, and he's one of the first ones that also emphasized on the importance of the language to understand the culture. So a very important man and a brilliant anthropologist. Upon his return to Germany, so Boas took post in the Royal Ethnological Museum in Berlin at the University of Berlin, where he taught geography. And throughout his career, he studied, like I said, so language, but also artifacts. He collected a lot of masks. The Kwakiutl people are famous for their masks that they use for different dances and different performances. Arts in general, archaeology as well, and also he studied the concept of race. So he's at the basis of what we call historical particularism. So here, Franz Bos, that's his name. And he's also famous because he trained a lot of very famous anthropologists that became famous after him. We're going to mention one right after. So according to Boas, anthropologists could not rely on an evolutionary formula to explain differences among cultures. Of course, it's not something that it's possible because we cannot compare, we cannot classify cultures since they are all important. So he said that we must study the particular history of each culture to see how it developed, and that's how we can understand cultures. So Boas turned this idea of historical particularism. Here you have a definition. So the culture arises from different causes and it's not a uniform processes. So he's the one who criticized the evolutionary theory. And he also turned the idea of diffusion. So here, that's why I wrote diffusionism theories. So here, diffusion is the borrowing of cultural traits and patterns from other cultures. So Boas believes in the powerful role of culture in shaping human life, exhibited itself in his early 20th century studies of immigrants, because he was himself an immigrant and he studied the importance of culture also through the immigrant situation in the US, and of course he reflected on himself as well. As a Jewish himself, so Boas was particularly sensitive to the dangers of racial stereotyping, and his work throughout his career served to challenge white supremacy and the inferior ranking of non-European people, which is another expression of racism. So he fought for that during his whole career. Talking about diffusion, if we look at here this picture, you might have recognized this very famous dish called kebab, that is commonly called kebab. And, you know, I wanted to ask you, where is kebab from? And maybe you would say the Middle East, or maybe you would say Northern Africa, or maybe you would say Turkey, or I don't know, maybe you have other ideas. Kebab dishes originated in the medieval kitchens of Persia and Turkey. So they were generally made with smaller chunks of or slice of meat, or ground meat as well, often cooked on skewers over a fire. And this cooking method has a long history in the region, where it would be practical in cities where small cuts of meat were available in butcher's shop. All right, and here the word kebab itself, it's so most likely an Arabic origin, and it came to English in the late 17th century, partly through Urdu language, Persian, and Turkish as well. So here, kebab is probably a very good example of diffusion. And what do we mean by diffusion? Because it has been borrowed from one place to another, and now it's completely accepted. For example, in the United Arab Emirates, where I live, it's considered to be somehow one of the local dishes that is served there. So there are two students of Boas who form together another school of thoughts. So far we talked about the evolutionary theory, moving on to the historical particularism and the diffusionism. And now we talk about what is called culturalism. So it's a school of thoughts that emerged around the 40s, 50s up until the 60s, 70s. And two students of Boas were at the origin of this school of thoughts. First, there is Ruth Benedict. She wrote this book here, Patterns of Cultures. And in this book, she talks about the powerful role of culture and how it is shaping human life and need to explore the unique development of each culture. So she used what Boas said about historical particularism and how it is important for each culture to go back to its history in order to understand where this culture is coming from. So she used that and she reaffirmed the power of culture and how important are fundamental for humans at large. And another very important anthropologist, she's most probably the most famous anthropologist in the US. She's also female. Her name is Margaret Mead. She's also a woman. She did fieldwork in many different places, in Bali, in Samoa, in Papua New Guinea. And she proposed that culture and gender roles, play just as strong a role as biology in influencing adolescent behavior. So she talks about enculturation and its powerful effects on cultural patterns and personality types. So she somehow linked anthropology and the importance of culture to psychology, and she tried to understand how we develop and how we evolve. So what is, it's this big debate, nature and nurture. So she basically tried to understand how much is it coming from the culture that we have and how much is more related to biological aspects. And she compared the US society and other cultures, and more specifically the Samoan culture, because that's where she did long field work. And that's her here in the middle, dressed with the traditional Samoan outfit here. She wrote a book after this field work called Coming of Age in Samoa. Very famous book, very well-known book. So in this book, she presented the idea that the individual experience of developmental stages could be shaped by cultural demands and expectations. So she explored that also through sexual perception and sexual experience. And that research was followed by another one in Papua New Guinea called Growing Up in New Guinea, and she somehow explored the same type of problematics. So here, enculturation in shaping behaviors. So both Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, they worked on the importance of culture, and both were at the origin of a school of thoughts called Culturalism. Now finally, the last one I wanted to address here is called Structural Functionalism Theory. And by the way, once again, this is not exhaustive, so I could have continued because I did not talk about the school of thoughts of the 70s, 80s, 90s, or the more recent one, 2000, 2010. But I just wanted to introduce you with some big names of anthropology. And this is also to show you how the concept of culture has evolved over time. So this one is was mainly developed by Branislaw Malinowski. You can see him here on the picture. So he's the white man here, carrying his notebook during the field work, and he did his field work in Papua New Guinea as well, in Melanesia in the South Pacific, and he studied the Trobriand people on the Trobriand Islands. Malinowski is famous, and we will talk about him again in not the next chapter, but the following one, because he's the first one who claimed the importance of doing fieldwork, of living among people, and he's considered to be the modern father of anthropology because since he developed that methods of going and interviewing people, going to the field, interviewing people. From him, after that, all anthropologists studied people using the main methods that he developed. So Malinowski wrote a very famous book, probably his masterpiece, called Argonauts of the Western Pacific, published in 1922. And he studied what is called the Kula ring gift giving. So it's an economic system of exchanges among the Trobriand islands. And there is another anthropologist, a British one as well. Malinowski was originally from Poland, but he worked and lived in the UK. He opened the chair of anthropology at the London School of Economics in London. And EVANS-PRITCHARD is also a British anthropologist. He studied in Sudan. He studied the Nuers people, Nuers, and he wrote a classic ethnographic book of those people, published in 1940. So both of them developed what we called structural functionalism. So what is it? It's a conceptual framework positioning that each element of society serves a particular function to keep the entire system in equilibrium, right? So this school of thoughts was developed in between 1920 and 1960. It is in rejection of unilineal cultural evolution, of course, as well, that many British social anthropologists view anthropology more as a science and fieldwork, more as a science experiment that could focus on the specific details of a local society. So these anthropologists view societies as, living organisms, and through fieldwork, they thought to analyze each part of the body. So they will analyze political, systems and structure, and they will look into beliefs and religion, and then they will look into kinship and family. And so each part, like politics, religion, kinship, and so on, would be considered as an organ, and all of them would be the society. So each part of the society, so including religious, political, economic structures, kinship as well, fit together and had its unique function with the larger structure. So for them, human societies are like human organisms, all right? And they all work together. They are all integrated, if you remember what we said about culture. So the British social anthropologists here employed a synchronic approach to control their science experiment, and they analyzed contemporary society at a fixed point in time without regard to historical context. So that's where this school of thoughts derived from the historical particularism. So it's a different view, right? It has been criticized as well. Structural functionalism has been criticized for ignoring, for instance, the dynamics of conflict, tension, and change within the societies that were studied. Their internation marked a significant turn in the study of society and culture by British anthropologists, and you will see all countries, they have their own school of thoughts. So in the US, like we said, it was more culturalism and also somehow diffusionism. In the UK, it's this one, and they were all influenced by another. That's usually the case in any discipline, by the way. Thinkers, they write articles and then they criticize what has been published by a colleague, and that's how we build upon different researchers. That's the end of this chapter. Now we will move on with culture and globalization. That is a short chapter.